If God is in control, just and all-powerful, why is the world in such a mess?
Why is the world in such a mess? This is the problem of evil, and it's a well-debated, well-known, well-rehearsed set of arguments around us. Melissa gave the clue in Adam and Eve and evolution. Here we've got the story of Cain and Abel, and the weight of the world is being born here because of the murder of the one brother by the other. And Adam and Eve relegated, they're sitting there, huddled figures. Above all of this hovering is still the Spirit of God. So you move from the bottom of the diagram, which has got the fish of creation, then there's the poor lamb, if you like, beneath. He's the murdered brother, he's beneath the earth now. And then you've got Adam and Eve, and above that, the Spirit of God hovers. So the problem of evil has been recognized right from the beginning of biblical times, and this story probably had its antecedents around the campfires. Maybe the question about evil in the world is actually phrased in an incoherent kind of way. We say, if God is in control, etc. Well, clearly, that kind of God that's been described in that way isn't in control. That doesn't get the heart of the matter, that the world is a mess, whether that kind of God is in control or not. The world is full of chaos. The world is full of cruelty. The world is full of unjustified pain and suffering. And it's our job as Christians to try to make sense of that. And I think we've mixed a couple of categories up when we're describing the problem of evil in this way.
Yes, I think you're right. Two things have been mixed. This came from a comment recently I had in a letter from a Christian woman in America. And she said, when I commented on some of the problems that I saw in the world today, she said, never mind, God is in control. And I thought, no, when I look around at the world, the things that I mentioned, God isn't in control, evil is in control.
Let's hear the question, Stuart.
How can the slaughter of an innocent party provide forgiveness for the guilty?
I took this to mean that you were worried by the idea that God sent his son to be sacrificed on the cross in order that the sins of the many would be somehow collected up into this sacrifice. Would that be right?
Well, that's what one group of God followers believed.
And perhaps it's what a majority still. I think the key word here is atonement. And that word atonement is simply three words, if you like, put together, at-one-ment. And the idea behind atonement is, how do we ourselves personally feel that we can be at one with God? And the atonement theory is that Jesus somehow atoned for all of our sins. And your questioner, I think, is probably a strong believer. Your correspondent, rather, is a strong believer in the atonement. So thinking, how could I possibly answer this? And I think that the answer comes from a poem by R.S. Thomas. And we've read this in worship services on a couple of occasions, and it's called The Coming. It's a very brief poem, and I'd just like to quote it to you. And God held in his hand a small globe. Look, he said. The sun looked. The sun watched them. Let me go there, he said. Let me go there, he said. Now, I think that's the kind of classical theological answer for problems with the atonement, that it isn't God demanding that his son becomes the sacrifice. It is God saying, I will be the sacrifice, and I will sacrifice myself through the Son. And that will take us to another question a little later on in your set. How do you feel about that? Any comments?
Oh, yeah. That question comes from me, not from other people.
All right.
I believe that you've hit at the important core of what this is about, and that's reconciliation with God. And I think a culturally accepted way of saying something very important was through the sacrifice of animals. I mean, that's gone for a long time. That was then applied to Jesus and God, but that's a metaphor that people used for something bigger, which is reconciliation with God. And it comes to the next question. Maybe, no matter how good that metaphor or myth has been, we could do with a change and keep the core meaning still there.
Yeah, no, that is the next question. Let me just go back to the previous slide. Sorry, I just want to stay with the image. And R.S. Thomas's poem talked about the river being like a serpent, being the serpent coiled, if you like, covered with slime. I think you'll find that many people who work with and believe in atonement theories, theological theories of the atonement, do have that sense that somehow something became flawed in the human condition. And the mechanism for that flaw, according to St. Augustine, was the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, brought about by the tempter, the snake. So there's the good fruit, if you like, but it's almost as if goodness tempts us into somehow making decisions that inevitably involve estrangement from God. So this is where the truths, the Christian truths, are very, very different from, say, the truths that are conveyed in Jewish philosophy, Jewish thought about Adam and Eve. There it is not seen as a fall. And now your question, I wonder if you could just highlight it again for us, please.
Yes, if the redemption myth is now outdated, what suitable metaphor can replace it?
The clear answer to me is it can't be replaced, because the redemption metaphor has become a consequence of the creation story, the creation metaphors. What I think is really going on is that emphasis is shifting within the mythology. So in the age of religious revivals such as Wesley or Carey with his Baptist missionary movements, etc., what you've got is a real playing on the idea of the need for redemption, the need for people to acknowledge their sins, that, you know, to get over the fall. What I think is happening in the 21st century is that the emphasis is moving back to the creation myths and the stewardship that's implied in the creation myths. I mean, in the 15th century, as Protestantism really gets going and Puritan capitalism starts to emerge, in the 21st century, I think it's very clear that a new mythology of creation has emerged, partly through evolution, partly through other scientific and technological advances. The great myth of the 21st century is the sacredness of creation, and it too was there in the beginning of the Adam and Eve story.
Yes, I find what you say interesting and clear, and probably the best answer one could expect now. I'm not sure that it ultimately answers the question that still remains in my mind.
Take us through to your next question, please.
I wanted to be very short. Is free will an oxymoron?
Yeah, I'm always grateful for short questions. It means I can get short answers. And here it's a question of learning to ask the right question. Now, your question is about free will versus determinism or predestination.
Yes.
The image that Melissa drew for Adam and Eve in evolution was that of, it's called the the molten bowl, if you like. It's a great big vat of water that the priests looked after, doing sacred ablutions, etc. And it's of significance because if you look at the biblical measurements for this, it turns out that using pi as the number 3. And that, to me, is the real clue about free will and determinism. Yeah. They couldn't quite work out the correct diameter, so by using an approximation for pi, and I mean, we could use much better approximations today, but that's the one that they chose to use. They chose to do something with a little bit of a mathematical formula. The diameter equals pi, the circumference equals pi times the diameter. So they had that bit of mathematics at their fingertips that they applied. Now, this to me is at the heart of the free will determinism problem. It's not, to me, an issue that can be decided around simple philosophical musing, theological musings. You've got to be able to look and interpret the world with a different set of eyes to understand how some of it is determined mathematically as a consequence of formula, and at other times as a consequence of scientific inquiry. Inbuilt, there is uncertainty. And so rather than free will and determinism, I think the right question to ask in the 21st century, how much certainty is there in the world and how much uncertainty? And that brings me all the way back to where we started at the beginning when we were talking about chaos. You know, there's chaos in the world, and that's got all kinds of moral consequences in the terms of the problem of evil. But out of the chaos, there emerges unexpected and delightful patterns and symmetries and consequences that are logical. So part of the equation says there's uncertainty and there's high elements of chance, and part of the equation says some things actually follow on from other things. And so, yes, free will is a bit of an oxymoron, but the question is very much alive. It's just phrasing it in the right way for our time. Any comments, Stuart?
That's an excellent answer. I'd be delighted to have given the same answer.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to your next question.
Is sin ever so heinous that it is past forgiveness? This came from another person's discussing this with me, and I think they were thinking about Hitler. And the comment the church often makes is, no sin is too great for God to forgive.
When I was a young minister in Timaru, and I had a number of returned servicemen in the congregation, and I preached one sermon where I said, well, you know, the Bible's crystal clear that God could forgive even Adolf Hitler's sins. To their great credit, they didn't sort of come bounding into the attack, as it were, but they said genuinely that they could not believe that. They thought that if that was what the biblical message said, it was wrong. And they believed that they had the moral ground and the moral authority to make that call because they had served, and at least for the ones in Europe, some of them had been involved in the liberation of the concentration camps. What I think is, in fact, the biblical affirmation, Wesley understood very, very clearly, and it was that every person could be saved, and every person could be saved to the uttermost. The question was whether every person wanted to be saved. And I wish I'd brought that aspect out more when I gave my controversial sermon back down in Timaru. It might have saved some pain. Would an Adolf Hitler even consider such a question is at the moment of death. I do remember that this is how we preached it on the occasion, that at the moment of death, one had the ability to think, are there things that I have regretted in life, that I wish I hadn't done, that I'm sorry for? Jesus' parables, of course, have there are a number of them that make the same point over and over again, that it doesn't matter what you accumulate in this life or how you project yourself in a public way. What matters is your heart right with God? And so Wesley's answer was, it can be, no matter what you've done.
Yeah, this is another question I got from a younger person whom I was discussing these questions with, and that was the question he gave me. And I think you gave the kind of answer that I find I'm rereading Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis at the moment. That's the kind of answer that C.S. Lewis ought to give him.
Yeah.
And I'm happy with it.
Really brought this out in The Great Divorce. The illustration here, I'd asked Melissa to somehow convey the sense that when Adam and Eve are driven out of the Garden of Eden, God places an angel there with a flaming sword. And the purpose of the angel with his sword is to keep them out from returning to paradise. That, I think, is the sort of mirrored a little bit in the parable of the prodigal son, where the elder son stands on the doorstep. Will I be able to get in or not? And the answer is yes, but you've got to make the first step over. So the angel with the flaming sword is the angel in our own minds that keeps us from the gates of paradise. There's a marvelous thing, I think, in Buddhism where a chap goes to a teacher and he declares himself to be a great samurai warrior. The Zen teacher says to him, "You are a great samurai warrior, you make me spew." Whereupon the would-be disciple pulls out his sword and raises it and is about to cut off the Zen master's head. And the Zen master very calmly says, "And there open the gates of hell." Samurai stops, considers, and puts his sword away, and the Zen master says, "And there open the gates of heaven." Max says, should we forgive ongoing crime? Well, I don't forgive crime. I forgive criminals.